I'd like to thank Kent Nonstead and Bob Grant for attending with me today. I want to thank our full board. I also want to thank all of our donors and active members that allow this group to do the things it does to protect the property owners, farmers and ranchers and citizens of North Dakota and the nation. And the Northwest Landowners Foundation commissioned this report. It aligns with things that this organization has done since its day of conception, with the bonding and many other things, as we'll get into as we go along. This full report is 2.65 gigabytes of information, probably 70,000 pages. We've tried to condense that down into a 2-page letter and a 21-page report. With that information, we're hoping that state regulators, legislators, think tanks in the state and across the nation can use this information to protect the land and citizens of the North Dakota and the United States. It's the first time I believe that this type of information has been available and organized in this fashion. We had a person working on this since the CARES Act report. When you get that volume of information, and it did not come in nice, neat little files. It was like it went through a card shuffler. And you take that many pages, of months and months and months just to reconfigure the files and then start to gather the trends of what was taking place with the CARES Act money. And it gave us the opportunity to quantify the costs to a certain level of reclamation, plugging sites. These are things that always have been debated on. What's the cost? What is it? How much time does it take? You know, the values, those type of things. So this is information with what's happening right next door now and in Washington, D.C., billions and billions of dollars and trillions of dollars that are being talked about, and the possible long-term liability that the nation, North America, Canada, as well, and North Dakota face. And so with that, I'm going to read the 2-page report just to get it in the record here. So bear with me as I read along here. Northwest Landowners Foundation commissioned a report after the North Dakota Industrial Commission appropriated CARES Act funds for its program to plug abandoned oil wells in the state. While well-intended, the program mostly leaves the landowners of North Dakota and taxpayers holding the bag. In many cases, the operations who had their wells confiscated and plugged are still solvent, and to this day continue operating wells in North Dakota. Some received CARES Act funds from the NDIC without even accessing their bonds that the law requires them to keep in place for this very purpose of plugging and reclaiming their wells. This is the result of using the CARES Act funds to reclaim abandoned wells in addition to orphan wells. Oil producing states around the country recognize their potential liability that attaches to old orphan wells in their states. They are working hard to prepare and avoid hundreds of millions of dollars in liability to these wells. North Dakota has started using CARES Act money to plug and reclaim wells, but the state has failed to limit its payments to truly orphaned wells. The confiscation of these wells will cause serious problems for landowners. In response to complaints from landowners, the NDIC has advocated for the law that would require landowners to wait 7 years to simply ask the question to review a well on temporary abandoned status. Landowners were not given notice of the operations completed on their land, owned property by the NDIC until the contractor was ready to do the work. And in many cases, contractors asked landowners to sign a liability release for the work that the contractor and NDIC admitted up front would not result in a full reclamation. Many of these reclamation sites were never finished and remediation is not complete, resulting in a significant contamination of numerous sites. In some cases, landowners had entire entered into surface use agreements that required an operator to make annual payments. Now the NDIC's confiscated these wells. The landowner no longer receives annual payments, and the NDIC has failed to finish its job and does not appear to have any plan to do so unless additional taxpayer funds are released. Northwest Landowners Association has been working hard over the past decade to educate the public and our state leaders about the massive expanding problem caused by abandoned orphan wells. North Dakota needs to follow the lead of other states that take significant efforts to address this issue, including reform of bonding requirements, moratoriums on operators, transfers of wells, reforms regarding temporary abandoned status, and elimination of blanket bonds. Otherwise, the problem will only grow. Currently, our taxpayers are funding the effort when the responsibility lies with the operator. That is wrong morally and legally. The operators who profited from the oil field should be cleaning up their wells when they are done. But they do not, because the NDIC allows them to pass off their oil field assets to less and less solvent operators until the old wells finally are left with an insolvent operator who truly orphaned wells. The North Dakotans need to be understanding that they are funding a massive cleanup without even knowing they are doing so, and without any effort to reform regulations, systems that cause the current problem. Only on the national level, the federal government is distributing large amounts of money to address the problem caused by the old abandoned wells, with little directive to reform the systems that led to this situation in the first place. North Dakota could show the rest of the country the lesson that is in this situation in the first place. North Dakota could show the rest of the country, I apologize, made a mistake there. And North Dakota could learn from other states who are ahead of us on this, have already learned. North Dakota, the federal government should also look at what went wrong in North Dakota before issuing additional funds to extending these programs. Otherwise, taxpayer funds being spent to clean up the oil wells left behind by solvent operators will still not be enough to cover the bill. And once the taxpayer funding dries up, unless there is some political will to hold operators accountable in North Dakota landowners will be left holding the liability for these wells. North Dakota Legislative Assembly passed specific laws in 2019 to assure that it is the landowner who will be responsible. The new law says that if no other viable responsible party can be located after the department reasonable investigation, the department shall consider a person that becomes an owner of the property after the release of the responsible party. That person who becomes an owner after the release is an innocent landowner. Yet the North Dakota Legislative Assembly had decided the same landowner should be on the hook, and North Dakota has spent all of the funds, taxpayer funds, it allowed to spend on this problem to be cleaned up on abandoned wells. Whether the mineral developer in the state are ever required to pay any of this cost is yet to be seen. North Dakota landowners are imploring you, whether you are from North Dakota or not, to stand up for property rights for landowners and not allow hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer funds to be spent without fixing the problem that got us in this place in the first place. We haven't closed a report on the North Dakota CARES Act program that our board commissioned after seeing that the North Dakota Industrial Commission was doing this with the CARES Act funds. We've also included materials we have obtained through record requests from the NDIC. The documents and the data were information themselves drawn from this. We made our own, we gathered this information so people can draw their own conclusions themselves. For example, Northwest Landowners Association has not fully analyzed all the costs associated with plugging and reclamation, but the data thus far is sufficient to draw one conclusion. Many plugging and reclamation operations cost far more than any bond would ever provide for this operation. In most cases, that actual cost of plugging and reclaiming greatly exceeds the bond amount. This tells us that the bonding is woefully insufficient to accomplish the goal, especially blanket bonds. There are lessons to be learned from the NDIC and the CARES Act report for its plugging and reclamation program. There is also precious little time to which to learn these lessons before hundreds of millions of dollars are spent plugging and reclaiming old wells without intentions to address the problem that led to this in the first place, and spending hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer funds to pay for plugging, reclaim old wells, some of which companies that are still solvent and operating wells in the state. Although the conclusion in this letter and report are our opinions, we have provided all materials, data, and reference use to allow anyone reading this report to dig into it as a source material themselves and arrive with their own conclusions. Our goal with this letter and report is to sound the alarm. There are a large looming problem on the horizon. If you do not address it, we'll leave the landowners holding the bag. With this letter and report, the politicians and regulators have been given notice of the problem. Whether and how you respond to protect landowners and the land they care for is your decision. But we will recall which decisions made during this critical time. Sincerely, Northwest Landowners Board. I know that was a lot, and that's a tiny bit when you look at the size and scope of this. That was just a couple page cover letter. If you go to our web page, that cover letter will be there. There will be this here 21-page report that just barely scratches the information that is available out there as well. You can go to our webpage, northwestlandownersassociation.com, and look at that. With that, all the supplemental information, the 2.65 gigabytes of information is there for other organizations, regulators to be able to analyze this. As far as I know, it's the first time in history to have this type of information that can be analyzed to help us determine what the real cost of plugging a well is, what the cost of reclaiming a well is. It's always been debated for years and years. Oh, it's this much. Oh, it's that much. But we did see through this exercise that we were going to do so many wells in this state, and we didn't get anywhere near plugging and reclaiming all of them, or completely plugging or reclaiming all of those sites with that money. So it became quite evident that the problem is a lot more expensive than was being admitted to. Like I mentioned earlier, this was a massive undertaking with many thousands of pages of information that's there. So we hope that people across the nation in North Dakota and our government officials to take it to heart and work with this. Because the problem across North America, North Dakota, Canada, all of us, it's hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars of liability. Our organization since conception has fought for proper bonding, proper regulations, adjustment of regulations, or enforcement of regulations to help with this problem. It's been our long-standing mainstay of that, and this here backs up everything that we've been talking about for years to try to help protect the landowners and the citizens of the state and the country. It was always thought and talked about that a well may cost $75,000 to plug and $75,000 to reclaim. It's quite evident now some can be done for that, but many can be hundreds of thousands or over $1 million to do. So the blanket bonds of $100,000 for multiple wells or $50,000 is woefully inadequate. We've pushed for more money in the reclamation fund, and we were told last session that that money in there was great plenty. Most of that's been used, a large portion of it, just since the last session. And, you know, 20-some million dollars seems like a lot of money in the size of scope of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. It's nothing. So it's something that needs to take heed. Some of our primary thoughts were, in this state, this program was set up for orphan wells, which means where you can't find the owner operator of it anymore. We have this kind of confused view of some of that in the state, where we used it for abandoned wells, which is a well that doesn't pay in economic quantities. So that's something that needs to be clarified as well. And many of these sites, as we're being reported to, are partially reclaimed, and were the plugging jobs proper? I mean, we did a lot of wells and sites in a very short time, and did we have the right qualified people to do that much in such a short period of time? Many sites are reported to us that the gravel was removed from the top and it was called reclaimed. So there's a lot of looming concerns that, are they properly reclaimed, and will that liability lie with those companies? Will it lie with the state, or is it going to lie with the property owner that many cases did not have the right to say no to access because of the right of ingress, but yet our state has taken actions to leave the liability with them? And also another thing is the confiscation of these wells, and people that had contracts with these companies, and as the confiscation took place, their payments ended, and the state was not honoring that. Another thing was, as I mentioned, leaving the liability with the property owners. Is this past session there was a piece of legislation that passed that we worked on, and we were able to modify it some for some protections, but in the end, this piece of legislation ultimately leaves the liability with the property owner, and that's what was passed by our legislature last session. Some of the takeaways I have is we are here to protect the citizens of the state, the taxpayers, and the property owners. We're hoping that other groups will pick this up and use it as a very, very huge opportunity to be aware of the massive issue that's looming. Across the nation, you have Louisiana, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado. You have many, many states that have this issue to deal with. Canada has the same thing taking place up there. It makes you wonder, say in North Dakota, is North Dakota taking over the duty and the obligation of the oil companies? Is the single mom paying taxes, taking on their obligation, the folks that have made millions and millions of dollars off of this? I guess I really want to thank all of our members and the citizens that donate and help support this small group. And this is a personal note, because the world has got so upside down that I don't recognize it. Remember to be kind. Remember to live life with what I try to is true and honest content in what you do. That's kind of a personal note. End of this, I will stand for questions, and if Kenton or Bob have comments, you want to make any comments? Or you guys have questions? You can ask any of us.
Yeah, I got a question for you guys. The phrase is massive issue that's looming, issues that are on the horizon. Those are repeated throughout the statement. Just how near is this horizon we're talking about? How pressing are these issues?
It's being talked about right next door. We're talking about $1.5 billion coming to the state. How much of that will be given to the energy industry? every one of these other states are dealing with these issues. We've been pushing forever for the folks that make the profit on it should take care of the liability that's there. That's why we pushed for the reclamation fund to be changed, how it's funded to be funded more properly to true and honest costs of reclaiming and abandoning sites. We brought that legislation forward. It was killed. And so that needs to happen. It doesn't need to leave the liability on the property owner that in some cases don't have the right to say no to coming onto your property. And as you can see with these numbers, say 75,000's on the low end and a couple millions on the high end, and you have a quarter of land that's worth $100,000. You know, it's a massive problem for these operations in the future. And just in this state, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, and across the nation, billions of dollars.
You talked about findings that some of the wells have not been properly or fully reclaimed as part of this program. I'm sure this is in the report, but do you know, like, do you have an understanding of like the percentage of wells that haven't been fully reclaimed under this program, or the numbers there?
We do not have all those percentages. As I mentioned, it's many gigabytes of information, and we're hoping that some of the large think tanks will pick this up and use it as an opportunity to help.
Is the issue with that you know, a company would come in and do the plugging, would remove the gravel, but maybe there would still be some contamination left or something along those lines?
Yes, that's some of the reports we have from the property owners that watched the process take place, and even comments to the property owner that, yeah, we're not dealing with all the problem here, we're just getting the surface off and covering it up, and that was reported to them.
Just follow up on that. Is most of that information coming from landowners, property owners, or are there findings from, for instance, like the oil and gas division that show, I guess, shortcomings in the reclamation process as well, or is that, I guess, mostly coming from the stakeholders involved?
I can speak to that.
But also, this is an opportunity to review that. Do we have the proper protocols in place to do this? Did we have the quality people to do this? If you go from reclaiming just a couple wells in a multitude of years to hundreds in a short few months, you know, is the oversight, is the regulation proper in there for that? We're not looking to cast stones here. We're making everybody aware of the looming large issue, and it's a devastating size of liability.
You had mentioned that landowners sometimes will receive annual payments from surface agreements. Do you have a feel just like for roughly what those payments might be? Are we talking like $1,000 a year, more than that, less than that?
Them are all privately negotiated.
Yeah.
So yes, they can be from smaller amounts of hundreds to thousands of dollars, and most of them would be thousands of dollars.
The only comment I was going to make is that you're wondering how soon this is going to happen to us and what are we looking at. 2005 and 6, there was 800 producing wells in North Dakota. And we've all seen some of the things that are left, didn't get reclaimed, didn't get cleaned up from those 800 wells. And now we have 18,000 wells producing. So the future does not look very good if we're not going to do the regulation and the cleanup that we should be doing. And it's going to make it look pretty ugly for the generations that come after us if we don't do something. And I think that's the biggest thing that we're trying to get out with this report is there's a good way to do this. The oil and ag can get along together, but you have to follow certain regulations. Developing one resource should not be at the detriment of another resource. And it should not put all the liability on the land of who it's going to eventually be, the way things are turning out. Thank you.
When you talk about the landowner, you have the mineral owner and you have the surface owner. In many cases, they are severed, so they're not the same. So that complicates the issue for that surface owner who probably didn't benefit at all from from the development of that oil. North Dakota's benefited greatly from development of oil. Nobody can deny that. But as the number of wells have increased, that becomes a product of doing business in North Dakota. They're going to be held responsible for that. We've somehow ignored those rules and regulations to hold people accountable for doing business in North Dakota. And so here we are with the CARES Act and asking for more appropriated dollars to do that sort of thing. That becomes an issue. When you think about an orphan well, was a well that did not have an owner. Did not have an owner. An abandoned well is a well that is not in production, but that has an owner. State of North Dakota now has expanded the definition of orphan wells to claim abandoned wells. And so they're taking on the responsibility of companies. We'll clean these up for you when it's your responsibility. We're talking $85 oil. Prices are as high as they've probably ever been in years. And so that's our concern, and we're leaving the surface owner hold the bag. Who's going to be responsible for that? When the state confiscates a well, they actually take ownership of that well. Does that mean the landowner is not able to still produce his ag products on that piece of property that he's given up 15 years earlier? They stopped payments to those landowners, and so the landowners that way. Senate Bill 2070 clearly states that the landowner, the surface owner, is going to be liable for future contamination. Think about that. State confiscates a well, and then you're going to hold the surface owner liable for that. Should he sell it to the next door neighbor? Well, here's a contamination spot on that particular property. So we look as landowners ourselves and future landowners across the state that this is a concern. And when the state wants to take this upon themselves without a plan to move forward, we're trying to correct something that's been a mistake for several years. We do not have a plan moving forward. How are we going to correct that? Are we going to have single bond wells? They fight that. They want the group wells. They want to put 100,000 bond out there for a group of wells. When that 100,000 bond would be taken up to clean up one well, you still have 6, 7, 8, 9 other wells that are in that. So they're not willing to give up that bond for that. So we need to push single bond wells and put that part in place. And so without a plan moving forward, this is what we're not hearing. Our concern is for the landowners. Our concern is for the taxpayers of North Dakota, because somewhere we're going to be holding the bag that we so appreciated to have the oil development come. And then are we going to be responsible for the cleanup? And it's been our concern from the beginning. Where's the plan? And that's what we're trying to advocate. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes. If I'm remembering correctly, last summer, there was some, I guess, debate or maybe public confusion at least about whether it was legal within the CARES Act constraints to put this money towards well plugging. And I think that probably became a more pressing concern for some people with the $60 million in fracking grants that came later. Was just wondering if you have positions on those questions in particular, or if it's more just a concern about the whether this has been conducted properly, but whether it was, I guess, legal to proceed with this kind of program first.
We didn't make that determination. I believe other folks will. There possibly will be an audit of this, and that will probably determine that as well. So no, we compiled this information because it was someone's a one-time opportunity to get this to show the size and scope of the problem in the state and across North America, and that was our goal. We made these conclusions that we have in the couple-page letter and the report, and beyond that, we're hoping a lot of other people with a lot vaster knowledge will pick it up, tear it apart, and come up with some very good information. So, no, we didn't make that analysis.
I have a question for you guys, as you're talking about that 2019 law that passed and maybe possibly puts liability on landowners in the future. Do you know if that law, I mean, has the state since then ever come after a landowner under that law, or is that yet to happen?
As far as I know personally, that has not happened. And with that, what would take place, if I have the understanding correctly, is if that person has the activity on their property and they knowingly know this, they're supposed to do a phase 1 or a phase 2 study. That's just not what the community is about, and the issue was not caused by agricultural activities. And so it's something that we worked on with the health department, and we did quite a few clarifications there. But the simplest way I look at it is everybody else can just walk away if they want. We can't. It's right there on our property.
And many times you never had even able to sit at the table or even say a word. You are not invited. You couldn't say no because it was all done for you.
That's a really good point that Bob makes, is we've advocated in rulemaking, guidelines, and legislation constantly. The one constant is you need the property to develop on. Why are we always on the shortest window of notification, or virtually we don't know and it just starts happening? So we're asking for that level of respect, because it's something that, like myself, the reason I do this is my daughter wants to farm. I want her to have the opportunity and not have that liability facing her. We've been at this for generations. We, in the farming community and property owners, we make generational plans in the future. If you're in an energy industry, and I'm not against any of it, I'm a mineral owner and all that, but one should not, as Bob mentioned, hurt the other. I want to see that things are taken care of, so next generation has the same opportunities that I've been afforded with farming and ranching. And we have noticed, we have had meetings, and this just come to me, with financial institutions, and there's been a big shift in how they look at lending on these lands. They're becoming more and more concerned and are looking at lending on this property differently because of the looming liability. Yes, sir.
I had a sort of a technical question, but things get a bit confusing for me when we start getting into the weeds of the bonding process itself. We're just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what specific prescription the Landowners Association would want in terms of what would be the appropriate bonding process. I think you had mentioned that single well bonding was what you were looking for, but I guess I'm just wondering if you could break down a little bit about what that means.
If you look back at our history, since we started, you'll find proposed legislation over and over again from every angle we could think of, get something done. From true and accurate cost of reclamation type bonding, which say you're in another energy and say you're in the wind world, that's what they're supposed to do. Why is, say, oil different? No, not. There is differences. It should be that way to protect the citizens in North Dakota and the property owners. That would be the main way. We've also looked at increasing the reclamation fund. And yes, single well bonding would make sense because, as this report shows in the information and what we've always known, one well may cost $75,000 And if you look at the NDIC records, it may show that there's only been one little spill here. This site has had one every year for the past 30 years. That might be a $2 million problem. So they should be true and accurate bonding requirements. We have advocated for the day that the bore is punched, that first operator pays in to a fund for that site instead of transferring down to the last company that's underfunded, and that's the one that's expected to carry that burden. It just doesn't make any sense to me. You know, when there's funds available and you're doing well, you should be putting things just like we all do in the savings account to take care of that bad day. But if you're allowed to walk away from all that debt or liability, you know, it's an issue. Did I answer partially for you?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so.
Do you know off the top of your head, 'cause I can't recall, how many wells can be on a blanket bond?
It's a multitude of them. You can have 6, or you could have 14.
I just have one other question for you guys. Do you happen to know how many of your members had a well on their land unplugged through this program over the past 2 years?
I don't have the exact number, but it's a multitude of them.
Okay.
Yes,
Like,
several.
Okay.
Part of this report that we're compiling, and we'll get it compiled, is what is the actual cost of it? Some of these rules and regulations were put in place in the 60s and have not been really adjusted up until now at this point. And so maybe $100,000 blanket bond in the 60s would be adequate enough. We're finding out that a reclamation of a well, just the plugging of the well is costing more than what the bond is. So that's something that has to be adjusted and it has to be done systematically. And so the reason for some of this report is, how much does it cost to reclaim a well? We're going to find that out. And we're finding out that 75,000 is not adequate. We're talking probably $300,000 or $400,000 is more the average case to actually reclaim a site, put it back in ag use.
Again, the takeaway is we're just trying to get the folks next door that are going to be voting on things, people in Washington that are voting on things, the folks in all these states that have similar problems, and in Canada. This is an opportunity to analyze this and rectify a problem and give us a better future. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
One more on that. Just wondering if you've spoken with many lawmakers about this report yet. I know that it's just coming out today and there are embargoes and everything, but do you have a sense for kind of what the appetite is among lawmakers to make any reforms here?
We have not talked to a lot of them yet, because we're just rolling it out right now. We are hoping that we will be talking to North Dakota legislators and department people and people across the nation. We've had some people that must have heard a little bit reaching out to us, but today is when we're rolling out, so we're hoping that we'll get a good sense of that here shortly, and we're here to help.